Ted Cruz breaks with GOP on biggest housing affordability bill in decades. Oh, Cruzy. I gave you props just a couple of days ago. For the first time I think I've ever given you true props for coming out and standing against the anti-IVF measures and part of the platform that the GOP is putting in place in Texas, that the more hardcore right-wing side of the GOP is pushing for right now, and that you pushed back against it, made public statements saying IVF is fine, I think it's a good program, I'm not against banning it, yada, yada, right? I gave you small props for that, but then you very quickly got to come back and make me remove those props real quick from you. Bad boy. U.S. Senator Ted Cruz withheld his support from a bipartisan bill aimed at increasing construction of residential housing while keeping Wall Street investors from buying up homes as a bet on the U.S. housing market. The bill passes the U.S. Senate 85-5 Monday, with Cruz and 9 other senators not voting. Nothing passes 85-5, okay? So if something passes 85-5 bipartisan, something like this, and you're one of the ones voting against it, that's not a good sign, okay? That's not usually, unless you're like Bernie Sanders and one of those handful of people voting against the Patriot Act or whatever, it's usually not a very good look. 4 days earlier, the Texas Republican voted against advancing the legislation for final passage. A spokesperson for Cruz declined to comment on the bill Monday, but Texas Republicans issued a statement opposing the legislation in March, questioning whether it would actually lower housing costs and expressing concern about overreach by the federal government. Oh, that federal government. You're questioning whether it would actually lower housing costs, right? Well, if you think there's even a chance that it could, then why wouldn't you be in favor of this kind of thing, right? Oh, because you might infringe the rights of these mega corporations to make even more money to exploit the housing market and economic situation in the country even more, right? It shows clearly where their head is, right? They're clearly far more interested in protecting rich people's interests and their ability to make a dollar and the ability to play the capitalist game than they are in protecting the affordability of the average American, to dealing with the cost of living, the cost of housing. It's very clear by this sort of statement and this sort of decision making where their priorities lie, right? A almost religious adherence to capitalism and the importance of free markets over literally everything else, even if it means the well-being of your own citizenry through the cost of living, through affordability crisis, through the cost of housing, etc. The bill is the first major housing supply legislation in decades. The housing shortage is the biggest it's ever been, 4 to 7 million homes. The vote comes amidst increasing tension around the cost of housing in the United States, with rent and home prices rising at a faster rate than income across much of the country over the past 2 decades, according to a 2024 report from the U.S. Treasury Department. Much of the attention has fallen on hedge funds and private equity firms that have expanded their footprint in residential housing over the past decade. In 2024, Governor Greg Abbott called on state lawmakers to pass legislation limiting what he described as corporate large-scale buying of residential homes. Abbott said the practice seems to be distorting the market and making it harder for the average Texan to purchase a home. The crisis is particularly acute in major cities like Houston and Dallas, according to a report earlier this year by the nonprofit National Low-Income Housing Coalition. They found the poorest Houstonians had among the least options for affordable housing in the United States, below only Las Vegas and Orlando. At least in Las Vegas and Orlando, those are some cool places to live in some ways, right? Houston just sucks, okay? All Houston has is traffic and mosquitoes, okay? So a federal housing bill would loosen rules around home construction to speed up new buildings. At the same time, it would limit large institutional investors from owning more than 350 single-family homes, with exceptions for newly built housing and homes that require extensive rehabilitation. Cruz took issue with a number of provisions in the bill, including a requirement the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development develop model zoning rules that states and cities could voluntarily adopt to try and speed up housing construction. I agree with President Trump that large banks should not be buying single-family homes. Unfortunately, this legislation goes beyond that principle, he said. I look forward to working toward a final product that actually makes housing more affordable for all Americans instead of expanding the government's authority to regulate who buys homes. Yeah, okay, yeah, so you're literally more interested in protecting these companies, these hedge funds, these private equity firms' ability to use housing as a commodity, as an investment vehicle, as an asset through which they can just hold on to and let it appreciate and not rent it or do anything with, depriving the housing market from tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even millions of homes, over the positive effects on the people that you're supposed to be leading for, your coalition, your Texas residents, who could have a lower cost of living because of this, lower rent prices, lower mortgage prices, more availability to buying houses and things like that, right? It clearly shows where his head is. It's a religious adherence to free market principles, whatever that means, and being anti-federal government regulation, even if those regulations make sense. And conveniently, they're only against these regulations when like they don't like them. They're very much in favor of federal regulations when it's against abortion and things like that. But putting that aside, they're not principled about that. It just shows where his head is, right? He's not interested in helping the average Texas resident, okay? He's interested in protecting corporate and business interests. Cruz is not alone. When the House voted on the bill last month, Texas Congressman Michael Cloud of Victoria and Keith Self of McKinney both voted no. One of the more controversial provisions is the cap on financial firms investing in single-family homes, an idea suggested by President Donald Trump in a social media post earlier this year. While a popular idea among politicians, the cap has drawn criticism from many in Washington, with think tanks from both sides of the political aisle questioning the effectiveness of such a limit. Yeah, I imagine that like they would probably still find some ways to kind of skirt around this, right? They could just make like an umbrella company and then like a bunch of these sub companies that each hold 350 houses or whatever reach that cap to collectively equal a large number of companies, but they're all really just part of the same umbrella company and they all follow the same rules and are managed the same way, right? There's probably a number of loopholes and ways that they could skirt around this, but at least it's like showing, at least it's moving in the right direction. At least it's creating some of these hurdles for these companies to do these kind of things, and in some cases would just straight up prevent them from going through all that extra effort to create these complex systems to work around these rules with loopholes. The institutional investor cap targets less than 1% of the market and sets the precedent that Congress reserves the right to keep any investor they choose out of the market for any reason and at any time, read a report by the conservative Cato Institute last month. If Congress wants more affordable housing, it should let the private market compete to supply it. But it already is doing that, right? The private market is already competing to supply it, and it's clearly not doing a good enough job. So like making some sort of a change to help regulate the market is the best way to do it, right? The strongest selling point of capitalism is competition, right? Now, competition isn't necessarily inherent to capitalism. You can create various types of contrived systems that have this competition element to it that aren't necessarily capitalism. But putting that argument aside for a second, the strongest part of capitalism is competition. But for a market to be properly competitive, it inevitably requires some level of government regulation, some level of government oversight, because markets will tend towards monopolization, towards consolidation, which is not, and trusts, which is not competition, which is not true competition, right? When you walk down the cereal aisle in the grocery store and you see that there's like 50 to 100 different types of cereals, but if you look on the cereal box, they're all owned by like 3 major cereal companies. That's not true competition. All these cereal boxes, these cereal brands and whatnot, cereal types are not competing against one another. It's a trust. It's false competition. And so ideally, you'd have a government entity come in and trust bust. You'd have and break up all these companies and say, no, you can't be owning all of this. You can't have this much market control. You can't have this much market consolidation, that you need to break it up. And that's what's best for the consumer, because true competition is what brings down prices and raises quality and creates the best environment for the consumer, which is the most important part of the equation possible. Trusts, market consolidation, monopolization, oligopoly, all of these things do not help the consumer. They aren't good for the average American. They're only good for the shareholder, the people at the top of the pyramid who are making a lot of money off the scenario, right? Because they inevitably lower quality and raise prices, right? This is the whole enshittification concept. How private equity comes in, seems to buy up a company because of fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders, because they're expected to not only be profitable, but be more profitable than the quarter prior. They're inevitably going to reduce the quality of the service, the quality of the product. They're inevitably going to have to raise prices, engage in shrinkflation, and all of this is sort of under the umbrella of enshittification. And so, yeah, it's not surprising at all where Ted Cruz's head on all of this is. His religious adherence to being anti-government regulation, even if those regulations are important to what he loves most, capitalism, right? Capitalism requires proper oversight and regulation by the government. It's just like very misguided, and it's very anti-average everyday person, because who does this help most, right? Like I said, this is going to be most beneficial for stakeholders, shareholders, executives, people at the top of the pyramid, and who benefit from a consolidated market that isn't properly competitive. I give him opposite props. I give him condemnation, bad boy, because he's not actually interested in helping the cost of living for Texas residents, affordability crisis, reducing their cost of housing, which has already gone up and disproportionately in relation to people's incomes over the last however many years. He's far more interested in protecting business interests and their ability to make a buck off of you.